Okay, well, welcome, Joe Abercrombie. Thank you for talking to Dark Matter.
No, pleasure. Really glad to be here.
What led you to leave your dazzling career as a minimum wage tea maker for a TV post-production company to become a freelance film editor?
Well, I suspect the answer's in the question there. Uh, it was kind of a natural career path. I suppose I had become a tea maker with a view to becoming an editor, and so that was the sort of natural next step in the kind of UK TV industry. It's quite modular, and generally speaking, editors are freelance. So being freelance was pretty much the way to go. Um, and yeah, so it was the natural thing to do, I'd say.
So why editing?
Yeah, it's a good question actually. I suppose it wasn't a long-held ambition in any way. I had done psychology at university, but didn't really feel that was what I wanted to spend my life doing. And so most of the people I knew at university in Manchester were from London, and so I moved down to London where the streets are paved with gold and all those things to look for a job. And I actually applied for a few jobs in publishing only because my mum had been a publisher, and so I knew a bit about that industry. Didn't get anywhere at all. And one of the guys that I was living with, his dad was a producer, and so I spent some time hanging around with him, carrying bags and cameras and things like that, and kind of got a nice overview of what that industry was like and what the jobs were like. And it seemed that editing was something that would suit me well because it involved sitting on your own in a darkened room staring at a screen, which I had some experience with, and was kind of a technical detail sort of job, which was something that I quite enjoyed. And so I sort of thought that that would be a good thing to get into. And the usual career path is you go and make tea as a runner in a post production place, and hopefully then get into the suites, meet some of the people, eventually act as an assistant, and then having assisted for a while and got a few contacts together, hopefully become an editor over time. So that was pretty much what ended up happening.
And yet you left. You've got this theme, editing, publishing, editing, but now you're actually on the other side of all of this.
Yeah, well, the writing was kind of something that happened almost randomly. I'd had some ideas about writing for some time. I'd been a keen reader for a long time. Um, I'd kind of felt a degree of frustration with some of the fantasy that I'd read in the 80s and 90s, um, but really loved that genre. And so I suppose I had ideas about how I might tackle it, how I might revolutionize and turn the world of epic fantasy upside down, that kind of thing. Um, but I'd never really acted on them particularly. I'd had a brief abortive go at it after leaving college as a sort of touch typing exercise, but it came out quite obvious and uninteresting, even to me. So you can imagine how uninteresting anyone else would have found it. And I suppose I really had time as a freelance editor because if you freelance in that world, you kind of will always have time off in between jobs. Things never butt up against each other smoothly or rarely. So you'll work for 6 weeks. You might have 2 or 3 weeks off before the next 4 or 5 weeks on. A couple of days off, a couple of days on. It's that kind of thing. There's always time off around, blocks of time off when other people are working. So after a couple of years of thinking this was a wonderful thing and not really doing anything with the time, I felt like I needed a project that I could kind of get my teeth into, um, and also something that was my own, possession, my own total control. Because as an editor, you do your little bit. You're a bit like a plumber. You're brought in to do one little bit of work, and that's it. You go away. Often you're told what to do by a director, which obviously I didn't like very much. So I felt I'd have a go at writing, and that was kind of how it came about. Really, it was something to do with my time, but this time around, I found straight away it had a kind of tone and a voice and a feel that right away I was quite interested in and excited by, and seemed greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, it was just something that emerged. The tone that it had was just something that naturally emerged in trying to write it. There was an irony there and a kind of interesting voice that it hadn't had before. And I was really interested in that and thought, yeah, I'll keep going and see what emerges. So that was really how it happened.
So you were in love with fantasy, or love hate with fantasy in the 80s and 90s, and you're a gamer. How do you think these two media have influenced your style?
Yeah, I mean, influenced my style a lot. I'm sure. I mean, I was a huge role playing gamer in the '80s, and as a kid, that was kind of my main hobby, I suppose. And me and a group of other lads used to meet up every weekend, and put out our Dungeon Masters screens and our huge boxes full of dice, all those things. And so I think that experience of creating adventures, of kind of storytelling in a sense, which is what games mastering is, I think, um, was very important. And my first kind of foray into making up things myself, and obviously also you do a lot of those kind of world building things, if you like, the drawing of the maps and the maps of buildings, the maps of lands, the kind of obsessive cataloguing and that stuff that I try to keep to a minimum in my written work now, I guess. But nonetheless, I think the experience of doing that gave me a lot of ideas, which I've gradually kind of incorporated in one way or another. So that was important. But then on the other side, I was also a big computer gamer from a pretty young age as well. I suppose my family were one of the first in the neighbourhood to have a computer, which was a 2K Acorn Atom in probably about 1980, I'm guessing. A friend of mine predated ours by a few months, but his computer was made out of wood and painted a kind of nice magnolia colour, real homemade. So it was very early on, and we had kind of very primitive games on that, and we bashed the keyboard and broke all the keys off playing games, and so I've kind of grown up with them, and I think computer games have been quite a big influence on me. How exactly that works into the books and how it manifests itself is always hard to say. I think all these things go into a big soup that you have in your head of influences and ideas, and somehow when you turn the tap to write things, a strange new brew of all this stuff is produced somehow.
I can imagine. Leo Avalon asks, who were your greatest inspirations, artistic heroes?
Artistic heroes. Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, the inspirations are many, many, many and varied. Because anything that you like or really dislike, you maybe dislike more sometimes is more important. But anything you like or dislike has a bearing on you in some way. Goes in and maybe sits there and interacts with other things. And so I've read a lot of very scattergun stuff, all kinds of things. I read a lot of non-fiction. So from a fantasy standpoint, Tolkien obviously very important, as he is to any fantasy writer, I imagine. But then also the commercial guys like David Eddings, Weiss and Hickman writing the Dragonlance things in the 80s, they all have a place in there. And then, on the other side of it's people like Ursula Le Guin and Michael Moorcock who were doing more kind of original things, I think, at that time. I think guys like Fritz Lieber and Robert E. Howard and Jack Vance are kind of in there, although possibly because they had such a big influence on the way that role-playing games were written and constructed. In the 80s, it was almost second-hand, their influence, the sword and sorcery part of things. So all of those writers, but then also a great range of kind of writers outside of fantasy. So Dickens, my mum used to read Christmas Carol to me every year, and that kind of had a big impact and effect on me. Shakespeare, watched a lot of plays in my time as well. And, I think that stuff inevitably leaves a big mark on you. But then a lot of Russian writers as well, Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov, trying to be a little bit more clever and highbrow, as you can see. And then, a whole other writers too. And in non-fiction, a lot of writers of military history, like Shelby Foote is one who I think I really admire his stuff. John Keegan. So there are a whole massive range, I think, of writers generally. And I think the more the merrier, the wider you throw your net, and the more influences you take in, the better off you are, hopefully.
Well, it certainly gives you a great pool to draw on.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think you want to. Some people, I don't read a lot of fantasy these days, and some people kind of say, "Well, how can you not repeat things? How can you be aware? You've got to be aware of what's out there in order to do something different." And I see it exactly the opposite way. To me, if you read fantasy, then all you can do is repeat fantasy. Really, you need to bring in things from outside, and the way to be original, well, original enough, hopefully, is to try and apply a wide range of influences to an established form and do it in hopefully a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. Well, they say there's nothing new under the sun, so it's a matter of being unique in your voice. And
Exactly. Yeah, I think what's often the most interesting are very familiar things done with a slightly, as you say, a slightly different voice, a slightly different approach, and small differences to an established form can be really interesting.
Yeah. You've written 9 books set in the same world. Would you like to tell us about them?
Oh, 6 actually.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. There's another 3 planned. Sadly, I haven't written those yet.
Oh, okay.
If only I had those, I'd feel much happier. And still got to write 3 of those. But 6, yeah, and they're set in the same world. Sorry, what was the question after that?
Would you like to tell us about them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first 3 are a trilogy, starting with the Blade itself, and they're really my attempt to write an epic fantasy, my take on epic fantasy. Hopefully, incorporating some of those things that I felt were missing when I read fantasy in the 80s and 90s. So I try and keep a tight focus on the characters rather than on the setting. I try and make them gritty, I guess the word is, realistic, honest, quite dirty, smelly at times. I try to make them involving and visceral, and also to have a sense of humour in there. And then I followed those 3 up with 3 kind of standalone books, I guess you could say. Semi-standalone, they're set in the same world, but they pick up some loose threads and some minor characters from the trilogy and put them in the foreground. The first of those, Best Served Cold, is a sort of fantasy thriller, I suppose you might say, a revenge story in a Renaissance Italy-like setting. The second one, The Heroes, was my attempt at doing a fantasy war story. So, I mean, a lot of epic fantasy has war very much as the backdrop. There are lots of soldiers and military men in the leading roles, but they tend to be very sprawling in time and place. With this book, I wanted to tell the story of one battle. So it all takes place over 3 days and on one battlefield, in effect, and follows a lot of characters on different sides of the battle. Then the most recent book, Red Country, was my attempt to kind of fuse fantasy and Western, I suppose. So it's not Western in it being 19th century America, clearly. It's more medieval's maybe the wrong word, but the technology is certainly much earlier. But again, it takes place on a kind of great stretch of unexplored frontier with settlers starting to make their way out into this unexplored wilderness and come into conflict with the indigenous people there. So it's kind of Western in its feel, I guess.
Mm. One of the differences I noticed between The Heroes, I have to admit I've only read The Heroes and Red Country, but one of the differences I noticed is that The Heroes seems to be set in kind of an ancient UK type environment, whereas The Heroes is Wild West. How complex, how expansive is this world you've built?
Well, hopefully big enough to get that level of variety in. I think, yeah, I mean, in a way, how big it is in terms of miles is not that meaningful because I could say, well, it's 1,000,000 miles across, and if I say it, then that's true. Or I could say it's 20 miles across. But I guess I wanted it to feel big and varied enough that I could get some variety in the cultures, some variety in the settings as much as possible, and so that I could find areas of it in which I could place scenarios that would work with a given book. So, as you say, The Heroes takes place in the north, which is a kind of relatively unadvanced area with a kind of feel of northern Britain about it, a sort of slightly Viking feel maybe. as well. Whereas Red Country is more of, as I say, a kind of an unexplored frontier that gives you a kind of rough analog with the American West, so that I could bring in some of those tropes and Western feel about it.
Yeah. In terms of fantasy, you've written pretty low fantasy. Like there is some magic, but it's very minimal.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just my taste, really. Generally, I've tended to enjoy books where the magic is quite rare and hence quite surprising to the characters in the book. Um, and that I just find more exciting. I find it more exciting when the magic's sort of unknowable and unknown and surprising and strange, and to some degree unexplained and unexplainable. Um, I find really high magic settings, for me, just a bit less involving, a bit less close to reality, and oftentimes they feel a bit less relevant. I wanted to write things that felt real, I suppose, up to a point where the characters certainly felt truthful and real. And so a low magic setting just seemed to make sense to me. I mean, having said that, I wouldn't want to lose that slight touch of the supernatural, that slight touch of the magical that I think people expect and kind of appreciate in fantasy.
Mm. Another difference I noticed is that in the heroes, there's a running joke about like every time someone dies, it takes them by surprise. But you seem to have moved on from that in Red Country.
Right. Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose people always are surprised by the moment of their own death, aren't they? I mean, people feel like the world is all about them. Um, and that was one thing I was kind of interested in getting across. I guess Epic big and sweeping and has a lot of minor characters in it, a lot of orcs that need to be hacked through, who don't necessarily, get a lot of plot time or development. But everyone is the hero of their own story in a sense. So I wanted to give that feeling that everyone feels that they're the hero, that they're the central character, that everyone has reasons and explanations, and no one is kind of unexaminedly evil just for the sake of it. They all think they're maybe not the good guy, but certainly, trying to do the best they can with the hand they've been dealt. And so that's kind of something I try and get across as much as possible. A lot of my characters are kind of bottom feeders, I suppose you might say as well. They're not necessarily kings and or knights or queens or powerful wizards. They're kind of the people at the bottom. They're the front line grunts. They're servants and scum of one kind or another often. So yeah, I wanted it to for the people to feel real and truthful, I guess.
Well, they certainly seem more accessible for not being the aristocracy.
Yeah, well, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I want them to feel like not nice people necessarily, but certainly interesting ones.
Mm. It seemed to me you might have been bringing in elements of steampunk into Red Country. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the term steampunk.
Mm.
It feels like now if you have a chimney, then it's steampunk. If you have anything even faintly industrial, then people go, "Oh, steampunk." Um, Steampunk is sort of. I have my doubts about it as a kind of literature anyway.
Mm.
As a style and as a flavor, I think it's out there, and people enjoy playing with that. But it has no identity as a literary thing.
Mm.
I don't think. I mean, there's very few books you'd say that this is a steampunk book, and if you do, it doesn't really mean anything about the book other than that it probably has top hats and I don't know mechanical clogs or something along those lines. So I'm not interested in that kind of styling, if you like, because it tends to also be a kind of very self-consciously a style thing. So someone will, they'll be dressed like Mr. Darcy, but they'll have goggles and a pistol with cogwheels on it. It doesn't actually alter or mean anything to the story itself. Often, I suppose I'm interested in industry certainly and in the Industrial Revolution because fantasy books often tend to take place in this kind of medieval theme park environment, which doesn't seem to change or develop. Has been the same for hundreds of years and will continue to be the same. And our world, the history of our world is all about the history of upheavals and changes and developments and growth. And so I'm interested in kind of industrialization within a fantasy setting and progress, commerce, money, all these factors that lead to big social shifts and changes. So certainly, I probably wouldn't say steampunk, but industrialization, yeah. Less punk, more steam.
There was definitely a theme of industrialization and development coming out, especially towards the end of Red Country.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it will probably be that the next three books tackle that a bit more directly and become a bit more industrial still.
Okay. If you don't mind, I'll ask you about the next three books shortly, but I've got a few questions from fans first.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Chris Andrews asks how your personal experiences have contributed to your characters.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for personal experiences. You extrapolate things, you kind of think about things people have said, all kinds of things kick off a little spark that then develops, and you don't necessarily base a character around someone but it may be that you observe a certain style of behavior which then you adapt or work in with other things in order to produce a new character. So I think there's no substitute for the kind of the truth of things that you obviously observe. There's also that thing of truth being stranger than fiction. You'll never dream up things as mad as some of the things that people just do by themselves. So yeah, I mean, real life's very important influence, definitely. But then again, I mean, as is reading widely and reading first-hand accounts of things and playing a lot of computer games and watching a lot of films and just taking in as much and as wide a kind of selection of media and influences as you can.
Cthulhu Bloop asks, will we be seeing more of Shy South? This is off Reddit.
Yeah, sure.
People on Reddit.
No. Yeah. What was the question again, sorry?
It got lost with the name, didn't it? Will we be seeing more of Shy South? She was one of Cthulhu's favourite characters.
Oh, nice. Good. Possibly. I mean, my policy, if I have a policy on returning characters, is generally that if I feel I need a character in a certain role, if there's a hole in the plot for a certain character, I'll tend to reach for one that's left over from a previous book, if there is such a character that will fit the hole. So I think that gives readers a bit of a sense of continuity. So yeah, I mean, I use them where I can, because why go to all the trouble of making a new character if you've got one that'll serve already?
And Shy certainly has a lot of potential.
Yeah, well, she may well be back along at some point.
C. O'Hare Y asks, will we ever see Logan Nine Fingers again?
It's funny, I'm already being asked this question again, which is kind of strange. I suppose I'd answer in the same way as previously. If it feels right and there's the right hole in the plot for that character, then I don't see why not necessarily. I've used that character quite a lot now. I mean, I think I could easily not have used him again. So having used him again, I would be surprised if I reached for that again, honestly.
Okay. He also asks you to come and hang out in the Reddit The First Law forum. Apparently,
okay.
You have your own forum.
Well, I'll be doing, I think, another Q&A on Reddit in November, maybe. I don't know if the date's been firmed up, but I'll be around there at some stage.
Oh, there'll be a lot of very happy people.
Cool.
Slug Leighton Rocking says, do you have any plans or ideas for what comes after you finish book 9 in your current series?
Well, I mean, I'm working on a little side project at the moment, which I'm hoping will bridge the gap, a considerable gap, until the first of this trilogy comes out. I've got a trilogy to do, and I kind of want very much to draft the whole thing before releasing a book if I can. because although that'll take a while to do, it'll mean hopefully that, if I can write the last book, then when I come to revise the first, I'll know exactly where I'm going and I can make the whole thing as cohesive and coherent as possible, which I understand is a good thing with a fantasy series, ideally. And then the end can match the start of all those things. And then also it'll mean that from a commercial standpoint, a business standpoint, hopefully the 3 books can come out in a timely fashion and have a relatively minimal gap between of a year or less.
You sound like the ideal author.
Well, I mean, yeah, people have heard this a few times before, of course. So don't count on anything. I think in a way, I'd rather give a big gap now, and then once a trilogy is underway, people can kind of get the installments of it relatively quickly, than to sort of end up with unpredictable gaps in between. And from a publishing standpoint, it means with those books there, roughly ready to go, you can pick the best time of the year to publish. You can get your marketing and your publicity nicely in place. There's not a sense of rushing. You can just kind of turn things over nice and regular, which would be good. It would be good to be in that position. So a bit of a gap now, and then hopefully a few books a little bit quicker later.
Right. Pappenheimer asks, while reading The First Law, after a while, Logan Ninefingers started to speak with this really low, raspy voice. He also very strongly reminded Pappenheimer of someone, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it at first. Then it struck him, there are a lot of parallels to the Nameless One. Given that you're a gamer and you used to be into RPGs, how much of the Nameless One is in the Bloody Nine, or is it really just coincidence?
I don't know who the Nameless One is.
Oh,
is
okay.
this Planescape, maybe? Planescape Torment?
Yes.
Yeah, I've not played it, believe it or not. Though I hear wonderful things about it, and people are always saying it is a classic of the genre, but I'll have to plead not guilty on that one. Yeah, so I mean that's either we're drawing from the same wells or just a purely a chance thing. I would say.
Okay. Justin Semmel asks, what was the inspiration for Inquisitor Glockta?
Well, various things, but chiefly having a bad back. I had a bad back for some time, and couldn't get up, and couldn't move around, very limited movement, and in a lot of pain. And it gives you quite a ruthless and savage outlook on the world when you're in that state. And I suppose I started just thinking about what it would be like to be in that state all the time, and what state of mind it would produce, and how, scary and ruthless such a person might be. I guess that was the seed of the idea.
Right. Medworst, some people are really mean with their avatars. Medworst Canny Chen asks, why is Glotka always licking his gums? Yes, he has no teeth, but it was kind of distracting.
Well, I suppose the thing about repetitive pain and injury of one kind or another is that you're sort of constantly faced by it, and if you have a pain in your back, it doesn't go away. It's constantly there, niggling at you, and you're constantly aware of it. And so I wanted to reflect that in the way that he was written, that there's this repetitive, endless routine of irritating symptoms and problems that he has, one of which is that lacking his teeth, he has to keep licking the kind of spit out of the gaps where his teeth used to be. And he talks a lot, and hence when he's talking, that's something you'd need to do. So that seemed to me truthful to the nature of the character.
Last time, you wouldn't remember this, but I actually email interviewed you 2 years ago, and you said you were researching your next novel by watching Deadwood, Unforgiven, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Ride with the Devil. You were playing Red Dead Redemption a lot, and reading a lot of classic and revisionist westerns. What kind of research are you doing this time?
Well, lately a lot of Viking stuff, actually. A lot of Viking-related things. I am reading a book called The Long Ships which is I think it was written in the 50s or 60s by a Swedish guy, and it's quite meticulously researched, but also has a really interesting kind of insight into the Viking mindset and a great sense of humour. So I'm reading that. I've read a couple of other kind of Viking-related novels. So Robert Lowe is one writer I've been reading quite a bit, who again gives a great insight into the kind of alienness of the Viking mindset. It's interesting because epic fantasy often, although it takes place in these other worlds, is very pedestrian in the kind of way its characters think. They're very much thinking a modern mindset like the guy next door might do. So good historical fiction can often give you, seem much more alien than epic fantasy does, because it, gives you the Victorian mindset or the medieval mindset, whatever it may be. So a lot of Viking stuff. And also, yeah, I've been watching a TV series about the Vikings, and that has tended to be what I'm doing lately. Yeah, Vikings.
So this is a trilogy that you're planning?
No, this is like a little side project that I'm going to hopefully cleanse my palate with before pressing on to going back to this world again. I felt a bit kind of, having done 6 of these books in a row, I felt a little bit burned out at times with the last one. Some of the joy had gone out of the writing process. Obviously, you can't tell that in the book, which is fantastic, as ever. But I felt it was a bit of a grind at times. So I thought it would be nice to get away to something brief, different, that I could just kind of, write without a lot of effort, hopefully, and I can just do and it be fun. That's the plan.
So this isn't going to be set in the same world?
No, it's not. It's a different thing, and a kind of very different format as well. Yeah.
How much can you tell us at this point in time?
I've told you already more than I can tell you.
Okay.
That's as much.
Well, thank you for that. And with your next trilogy that you have planned, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, that will be in the same world, and that will probably take place a kind of few years on, again, from Red Country. So it will be 20 or 30 years after the end of the First Law, probably. And it will probably take place mostly in the Union, or certainly partly in the Union, and kind of focus on, I suppose, a new generation of characters without wanting to be too cheesy. First Law, the next generation. So some of the characters from the First Law will sort of be in the background, as the older statesmen, if you will, and their children and people of the age of their children will sort of be perhaps more in the foreground. That's roughly the idea. More than that, I can't really say. Not because I'm unable to. Well, not because I don't want to say, but because I haven't really thought about it enough yet to actually tell you exactly.
So, do you have anybody writing you on this apart from the fans?
Well, my publisher always want more books, but I think I've got a very good relationship with my editor, and I keep her informed exactly as to what's going on. So she's known for a while I wanted to, have a bit of a break at this stage, and also that I wanted to write a trilogy as 3 books, so that there's probably going to be that big gap there, or a gap certainly. I don't know how big it'll end up being, but considerable, more so than there has been before. So she knows what's coming, and doesn't necessarily press too hard. I mean, I'm sure there will be some degree of pressure from readers, and I mean, the thing is, when you publish a book, you straight away then get emails saying when's the next one arriving. So it's quite kind of horrifying from that point of view. Although much better than the alternative of no one caring or asking when the next thing will be. But a lot of that pressure comes internally. You want to build on such success as you've had. You want to put more books out and be in the marketplace. That every book you put out kind of helps all the other books and keeps you in mind. And so you're always wanting to sort of push on. It's a tough treadmill to get off once you're on there. I don't think anyone's ever so successful that they don't need to follow things up. So most of the pressure comes from me, really, if I'm honest.
And you're currently touring Australia.
Yeah.
How was GenreCon?
It was great, yeah, and really nice to kind of fantasy authors spend a lot of time within the kind of bubble of sci-fi and fantasy and horror, maybe. So you meet a lot of writers of that type. It was really interesting to kind of be on some panels with a lot of romance writers, thriller writers, who maybe see things slightly differently, have some interesting different takes on things. and also, to meet some Australian publishers and agents and just get an idea of what the industry is like here, how it differs, and how it's the same. And yeah, so a really nice event. I mean, it was very much quite a professional event, or not fans so much, but a lot of writers, a lot of aspiring writers. So it was, nice to try some different things. And then I'm off to Supernova in Brisbane and Adelaide, which I imagine will be the exact opposite. It will be kind of all fans, and so that'll be a nice contrast, I expect.
Yes, yes, you're seeing the best of both sides of that coin.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Are there any particularly interesting differences between the Australian publishing scene and the UK?
Well, the cost of the books is certainly it takes you aback a bit.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
I mean, because the mass market paperbacks are the first floor, and these are brilliant books. I will underline again. So there's no price is too high in many ways. But $27 for a mass market paperback, and in the UK, the RRP is £9, I think, £9. So that'd be about $16, $15. But then no one pays £9. They're always discounted. So on Amazon they're about £6. So yeah, about $10. So a third of the price nearly, which is a shocking difference. I'm not sure what the explanation for that is, or how that can kind of continue. I can't believe that the actual cost of shipping them or printing them or whatever it may be can be so much more. So it's a slightly weird one, that. I'm not sure exactly where that derives from, but certainly very noticeable. Yeah, I mean, other than that, I think in many ways it's pretty similar. You have agents, you have writers, and a lot of aspiring writers. It seemed as though there are quite a lot of kind of writing groups and societies, professional kind of groupings that give a lot of support to new writers here, which I'm not so aware of in the UK, and is obviously a really nice thing to have. Other people that you can bounce ideas off and learn about how, what their path to publishing might be. I think that would have been a useful thing for me. So that's a handy thing to have, certainly.
Okay, I have two more questions before we go.
Sure. Yeah.
BRWise42 asks, will you be weirded out, flattered, or indifferent when his Abercrombie-inspired tattoo sleeve is finally done in a month or so?
Oh, I'll be hugely flattered. I'll be very impressed with that. Yeah, I'll need to see some pictures without a doubt. I need to see some photos of that because I was at a signing with Peter V. Brett recently in London and Mike Cole, and there was a girl in the queue who was all covered with tattoos of Peter Brett stuff. And I saw that and thought, well, that's disappointing because no one's got tattoos in my books. They just don't care enough. I don't really have fans. I have casual readers. You see, Brett has fans. I just have people who read the books and chuck them away. So it will be very, very nice to see that someone has gone to the extent of indelibly inking themselves with things related to me. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
Avi Burnshaw asks, what did you do with Fitch?
He was just a drag on me. He was kicked upstairs. He sits in the boardroom, eating biscuits, and has his name on the letterhead. That's good enough. He's happy with that. He was never really contributing anything anyway.
So he's the managerial silent partner.
He's the sleeping partner, and I tend to blame him for things a lot. So when my editor says, Joe, you really need to rewrite this chapter because it's not up to your standard, I say, well, I'd love to rewrite that chapter, but Fitch won't have it. Fitch just won't have that. He won't allow it. And if I go to a hotel and the TV doesn't work, then I can phone up pretending to be Fitch and have a massive tantrum about that. That's the kind of thing I need. Yeah, useful.
Sounds very useful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for talking to Dark Matter.
Yeah, thank you.